similar pattern in the wars of 1945, 1950 in China, Indochina, and Korea, when cities and towns changed hands. Seoul, for example, changed hands 4 times in less than 1 year during the Korean War. The city of Siping in Jilin province in China changed hands 3 times during the Chinese Civil War. In addition to the widespread deaths and severe hardship inflicted on the civilian residents by these repeated battles, their conquest and reconquest by the different sides forced the local inhabitants to choose sides. And those who chose a side inevitably became vulnerable to reprisals once the city changed hands again. So while historians have rightly begun to explore the excesses committed by the colonial authorities and their allies, I have tried to show in this book that in these conflicts, the other side, the anti-colonial side, also engaged in conduct that resulted in the mass death of civilians. If the Dutch carried on arbitrary arrests and torture and summary executions in Indonesia, the Indonesians carried out widespread murders of Dutch, Chinese, and Eurasian civilians during the period known as the Bersiap in 1945 and 1946. During the War of Independence against the Dutch, Indonesian guerrillas, militia associated with the movement known as Darul Islam, frequently executed villagers that they suspected of collaborating with the Dutch. The conduct of the Chinese nationalist troops during the Chinese Civil War is well known, and Taiwanese still remember the so-called 228 incident, when at least 5,000 and possibly as many as 30,000 civilians were massacred in February and March of 1948 after an uprising against Chiang Kai-shek's forces, who had taken possession of the island following the Japanese surrender. Communist troops in the Civil War, in the Chinese Civil War, did not abuse the population, but in 1948, the People's Liberation Army carried out a deliberate starvation campaign against the nationalist-held city of Changchun in what was then Manchuria. During a 5-month siege, the city's population decreased from around 400,000 to about 180,000. One Chinese writer has argued that the deaths in the city were probably greater than those in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So all the belligerents probably deserve a place in the atrocity sweepstakes. However, a number of other capable historians and journalists are addressing questions of accountability and reparation in the wars of decolonization. And my book, as I mentioned, is primarily, though not entirely, a military history. It examines the nature and composition of the warring forces, their leadership, military effectiveness, strategy, and operational methods in the context of the political, social, and ideological forces that influence their behavior. And I argue that whatever the larger significance of decolonization in East and Southeast Asia, its nature and duration were significantly influenced by events on the battlefield. Whether the battlefield was a clearly defined area of operations, as in the battles of Dien Bien Phu and the Wei Hai and the Incheon landing, or whether the battlefield was characterized by patterns of irregular warfare, terrorism, and massacre spread over entire provinces or regions. So let me end with just one example, a brief description of one of the most important battles of this period that you probably never heard of. I selected this example because it concerns an issue that is still very much with us. That issue is the relation of the People's Republic of China to Taiwan. In June of 1949, after massive victories over the nationalists in 1948 and 49, Mao Zedong decided, like Xi Jinping some 70 years later, that it was Taiwan's destiny to be reunited with China. And Mao Zedong ordered General Su Yu's Third Field Army to begin immediate preparations for an attack against Taiwan. General Su Yu was one of the great Chinese generals of World War II and the Civil War. He's known as one of the 5 great marshals of China. And during the late summer of 1949, Su Yu's forces captured Fuchao, the capital of Fujian province, and then the coastal city of Xiamen in mid-October. Their next objective was the island of Quemoy, now called Kinmen, about 10 miles from the Chinese mainland. The capture of Quemoy would be necessary as a preliminary to any invasion of Taiwan. The attack on Quemoy was assigned to Su Yu's 28th Army. The 28th Army had no experience at all in amphibious operations. Many of its soldiers had never seen the ocean until they got to Xiamen. The entire invasion force would have to be conveyed in junks. Many of the junks were sail powered. The junks would have no naval escort. The PRC had no warships at that time. And of course, it had almost no air force. So there wouldn't be any naval or air cover. And because of the tides on Quemoy, a landing could only be made at night. Artillery on the mainland could reach Quemoy, but they would have to cease fire as soon as the junks reached Quemoy, because the PRC also had no radios, so there was no way to direct their fire away from the landing force. So by late October, the 28th Army had collected enough junks to carry 13,000 men in 3 waves to Quemoy. The People's Liberation Army intelligence estimated that there were about 12,000 nationalist soldiers on Quemoy. In fact, there were 30,000 nationalist soldiers on Quemoy with 21 tanks. The aircraft from Taiwan could reach Quemoy in about 20 minutes. The island commander on Quemoy was General Hu Lian. He was a hero of World War II and probably the best general in the Nationalist Army. Hu Lian's army defending Quemoy consisted of many new recruits and actually, that turned out to be a plus because they were too young and too uninformed to be afraid of the People's Liberation Army. They didn't know what they were in for, so to speak. The commanding general of the 28th Army and his political officer didn't like the plan for the invasion of Quemoy at all. They pointed out that there would be no time for amphibious training for the PLA troops. No hydrographic information had been collected. There was also a shortage of captains of junks with local knowledge. Many of the junks had been conscripted from all over the China coast. And so General Su Yu suggested postponing the operation until he could at least get enough junks together to carry 20,000 men rather than 13,000. However, Mao Zedong overruled all the generals, and the invasion was set for October 24th, 1949. In the meantime, General Julian put the nationalist troops on Quemoy through a lot of training and exercises. And on the night of the 24th, a platoon of tanks was training on one of the beaches when one of the tanks had a mechanical failure and broke down. And the other two tanks in the platoon were ordered to stay on the beach overnight with the disabled tank. Also on the beach that night was the Chung Lung. The Chung Lung was a former LST, American LST, given to the Chinese Navy. And like most of the ships in the Chinese Navy, it was engaged in a very profitable smuggling operation. In this case, it was smuggling peanut oil made on Taiwan back to the mainland. However, the supply of peanut oil was not quite ready yet, so the Chunlung's captain had to stay overnight, and he reported that he was staying over because of bad weather. Well, the weather really was bad that night. The invasion junks ran into high winds, very violent waves. Most of the junks were carried past the point at which they were supposed to land, and the majority landed near the town of Guningdao. And as the PLA troops came ashore, they found themselves under fire from the three tanks that had been left on the beach. The communists had no anti-tank weapons, and they couldn't get any, as I mentioned, they couldn't get any help from artillery fire on the mainland. The Chunlung, which was also, as I mentioned, on the beach, still had a large number of 40 millimeter and 20 millimeter guns that had been installed by the Americans to defend against kamikazes during World War II. So all of these guns were directed against the invaders. Excuse me. However, what really doomed the communists was that they couldn't bring in reinforcements. The receding morning tide had left over 100 junks stranded on the beach. And at first light, nationalist warships offshore opened fire on the junks, while planes from Taiwan swooped in and set them on fire with rockets. The battle on Quemoy continued for 2 more days. The PLA were not able to send in any more junks with reinforcements, and or only a few junks. And when eventually the communist forces surrendered or were wiped out by the night of the 27th of October. The nationalists lost, the communists lost about 4,000 troops and had 5,000 taken prisoner. The nationalists lost about 1,200. So the Battle of Guningdao, even though it was small potatoes compared to the gigantic battles that had been waged in Manchuria and North China during the Civil War, was a tremendous lift to nationalist morale. And Chiang Kai-shek pronounced it the first step in the road back to liberating China. But still, the battle wouldn't have amounted to much, except for developments in another part of Asia. Chiang Kai-shek left the mainland for the last time in December of 1949. The People's Republic of China had already been formally established on October 3rd of the same year. General Su Yu was working on a program to acquire foreign shipping and repair and refurbish captured nationalist warships in preparation for a full-scale invasion of Taiwan involving 500,000 troops. In April 1950, PLA forces captured Hainan Island, and General Su Yu announced that he expected to begin large-scale maneuvers in preparation for an attack on Taiwan in the spring of 1951. In the meantime, however, North Korea invaded South Korea, and that changed everything. More than 70 years later, Taiwan remains independent and Kinmen remains part of Taiwan, thanks in part to this obscure battle that nobody ever heard of. Okay, and I'll stop here and try to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Ron. That was a fantastic talk. I really appreciated it. And there's just a number of very interesting points that come up. I'm, the moderator, and I'm going to sort of abuse my privilege as moderator to make a few comments and ask a few questions. And again, I do encourage people with questions to put them in the Q&A box. I'm definitely going to ask my questions, but I'm also going to make sure that there's time left over to take a number of questions from the audience. So, first of all, I think what strikes me is you're sort of saying, well, I'm a military historian, but I think your idea of military history is at this point bleeding into social history very much. And, there's a lot of parts in the book and a lot of things that you're talking about that sound, quite a bit more like social history because they deal with sort of the conflicts between people on the ground. Then they sound like a sort of, at least my perception of military history. It wasn't really till your last example about the battle between the CCP and the GMD that I said, okay, that sounds, that sounds more like usual military history. But I wonder if, I guess the question that I have that sort of comes out of this, though, is your idea of a battlefield seems pretty large here and pretty broad, right? It's not sort of my typical idea like the Battle of Gettysburg or other major battles fought in World War II. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit more. How did you come up with this notion of a battlefield? And is this sort of an expanded definition of the concept?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I would just say that rather than having social history bleed over into military history, I've tried to do the opposite. That is, have military history bleed over into social history. But to address your main point, which is about the concept of a battlefield, I plead guilty to sort of abusing that term, but I think you needed to do that in this book because, for instance, you do have a very, what most people think of conventionally as battles, like the one I just described. You have a large number of them in during the Chinese Civil War, where there's a discrete area where two more or less organized armies meet, and you can usually determine the outcome. But through a lot of these conflicts, you also have much more confusing, protracted encounters, guerrilla warfare, irregular war, terrorism. And if you look at the Indonesian conflict, the Indonesian, whatever you want to call them, the Indonesian forces of the Republic of Indonesia who are fighting the Dutch, they actually only fight one big battle which you could describe in the way I talked about Gunung Dung. And that big battle is actually at Surabaya against the British. After that, the war they actually win with the Dutch is conducted in a large number of unconventional ways. And there is a fair amount of fighting, but you can't really describe it in any kind of coherent way. Although I try to do that in the chapters, but if you talk about the Dutch Indonesian war, it's much more diffuse, much more unconventional.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. And I'm going to ask, the questions are starting to pop into the Q&A box. So I'm just going to ask one more of my own questions, then we'll go to the Q&A from the audience. And if there's more time after that, I'll come back with a few more questions of my own, but it may take you a while to answer what's filling the Q&A box. But I guess the one other question I had that was prominent is when you talk about the violence and death and killing that occurs in Asia during this period between the end of World War II and 1955, I think one prominent example is the partition of India and the subsequent, killings that occurred between Hindus and Muslims, and all of the violence that accompanied that partition. And this partition also represents a kind of decolonization. And so it's also a sort of post-colonial struggle. And so I'm wondering, I didn't hear you say very much about India. It seemed like you talked much more about East Asia and Southeast Asia. So I'm wondering where South Asia fits into this narrative. And if it's not included in the book, why did you choose? What made you say this doesn't go with the kinds of violence that I'm talking about here?
Well, I originally intended to include India, although I wasn't going to focus on partition. I was going to focus on the war in Kashmir. And the reason for that was the war in Kashmir, it's still going on, so to speak, whereas partition, awful as it was, it's over. And so I was going to try and link the violence in India with these other developments. The only problem was the book would have been about 300 pages longer, and my editor wouldn't stand for that. So stand by for another book about partitioning. I don't think, though, that with all the distinguished work that's been written on partition anyway, I don't think I'd want to undertake that, but perhaps a book on the war in Kashmir, if possible. So that's my answer. It would have been good to include India, but
Okay.
it wasn't feasible.
Yes, thank you, and totally understandable. We always, I think every historian, whenever they write any kind of book, the hardest thing is always to decide what to include, what not to include, and if you choose to include this versus that, what are the advantages and disadvantages? So there are, as I mentioned, a number of questions coming from the audience, and I'm going to ask a few of these. I think the first one comes from someone whose name appears as Mikhail, and I am thinking that may well be our colleague Sean Mikhail, especially since the question is about Southeast Asia and Vietnam. But let me go into, let me just read off the question. It says, in the Indonesian and Vietnamese case, different factions took advantage of the fact that the U.S. had left behind huge stockpiles of weapons, which different sides tried to buy. And in parenthesis notes, a family friend spent time in Dutch prison for selling such weapons, actually. And that's a real hint that it's Sean Mikhail. To what extent did Americans with these stockpiles shape the war in China and the Koreas?
Okay, and China and Korea are the prime examples of the warring sides using American weapons. As a matter of fact, the French, I think Bernard Fall in his book mentions that the French used to joke that in the Indochina War, both sides were fighting the war with American weapons. The French had American weapons because the Americans gave them to them, and the Viet Minh had American weapons because they got them from the Chinese, who had captured them from the Americans in the Korean War, and captured them also from the South Vietnamese and Canadians and so on in the Korean War. In the case of Indochina and Indonesia, I'm sorry, in the case of Indonesia, there weren't all that many American weapons. There was some that the Dutch had brought with them, but the main source for the PKI for the Indonesian army were purchased and captured Japanese weapons, and that they actually were able to acquire Japanese weapons on a very large scale. And one of the ways that Sudirman, the commander-in-chief of the Indonesian army, he was a very good soldier. He won a number of engagements, but one of the ways that he rose to the top is that he seemed to have a talent for getting more of these, acquiring more of these Japanese weapons than any of the other generals.
Okay, thank you. We have a number. Some people have asked multiple questions, and so please understand if you've asked multiple questions. I'm going to take one of them and then come back if there's. I want to give as many people a chance to ask questions as possible. So I want to take a question from Mike S. Goodman, who identifies himself as an alum, hopefully of GW, and as a PA, as an ABD, I believe, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Mike asks, wasn't there also a large loudspeaker propaganda war waged between Matsu and the mainland for much of the Cold War? And I guess he's referring to this sort of long-lasting conflict, of course, over the Taiwan Straits that occurred between the PRC and the GMD.
Yeah, I can't speak to the period after 1950, but certainly in 49, there certainly was a big loudspeaker war. I quote from the reminiscences of a young woman who was in some kind of nationalist youth organization, I guess sort of like the Red Cross or the Girl Scouts. And she said that each time after they finished their work for the day on Quemoy, they would go over to where these loudspeakers were, and they would yell quotes from Sun Yat-sen to convince the communists that they were on the wrong side. So yeah, I think there was a lot of that. Also, during there's one memoir mentions that during one of the many fights for the city of Siping in Manchuria, that the communists knew that, or I'm sorry, the nationalists knew that a lot of the communist troops had recently come up from southern China, so they would play southern music over the loudspeakers. The idea was to make them homesick. So.
Okay, thank you. Just very interesting, and I think I think there's also a pretty extensive literature on the conflict between the GMD and the PR and the CCP over Jinmin and Maza. Of course, what first comes to mind is, of course, Michael Zoni's book Cold War Island, which really looks not only at the military dimensions of the conflict, but also at sort of the enduring social and cultural impact that these two episodes of shelling the island have. So I have another question here. This is sort of, I guess, two connected questions. And it comes from Alex Ferguson, who's from the University of Sheffield. And Professor Ferguson asks, he says, I was wondering if Professor Spector could say a little bit about periodization. Was this simply the most violent decade of the post-war era in Asia, or are there any other, or are there other reasons that made this decade particularly unique or significant? And then later asks, and connected to that, why end in 1955? What marks the end of this particularly violent period in Asia?
Okay, that's a good question. Part of the reason for ending, of course, is, again, the book can't be 1,000 pages long. But the other reason for ending at this time is there are certain important questions that are settled. North and South Vietnam are partitioned. North and South Korea are partitioned at the same time. The Chinese Civil War has been settled. Indonesia has its independence, and also the British war in Malaya against the against the communists there it's not over, but it's pretty much been settled in favor of the anti-communist side. And I do have a very brief description of the Darling meeting between the leader of the communists in Malaya and the new leaders of what was going to become Singapore and Malaysia.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a great answer. And I mean, I certainly agree. A lot of these major conflicts wind down and are settled by 1954 to 1955. And of course, you also have the Geneva Conference in 54 and then the Bandung Conference in 1955. And, you know, I think it's right about this time that China really says, well, what we're interested in Asia is actually peaceful coexistence. And I think that's also an important factor when it comes to sort of moving towards settling and resolving a lot of these conflicts. Some of them flare again, and maybe we can talk about that as well. But I do think, you know, what you said about why 54 to 55 is a logical cutoff point is completely logical. And if I were, you know, in terms of periodizing things, I don't know how you could call this, but I think, you know, saying it's the early Cold War or something of that nature, at least from the Asian perspective, makes a good degree of sense. So I'm going to turn to another question. This one comes from Ian Everhart, and Ian asks, in 1945, the United States possessed by far the most powerful and largest military machine ever to exist. And the USA had heavily subsidized number two, the USSR, during the preceding 4 years. Yet many calamitous developments occurred in Asia soon thereafter. The CCP's conquest of China seems to me to have been preventable if we had used our massive financial manpower, industrial and material resources to properly prop up the KMT. The founding of the PRC entailed the deaths of millions of Chinese civilians, while the PRC's emergence as a capable and hostile adversary of the USA in the 21st century may have major consequences for us all in the coming years. To what extent should the FDR and Truman administrations be reassessed for their strategic and humanitarian legacy in Asia? So it's a sort of interesting question that I think goes back to the whole lost chance debate about American policy and Mao Zedong.
Okay, well, of course, after what was called the loss of China in 1940, was called in the U.S. the loss of China. In 1949, there was tremendous political debates and name calling and accusations about who was responsible for the loss of China. Couldn't we have prevented it? Of course, the U.S. had done a lot to try to prop up the Chiang Kai-shek regime, and most of the people involved in that effort, in the end, just threw up their hands and just decided it was hopeless. But nevertheless, the U.S. did make a huge effort. Now, the first part of your question, though, is the U.S. had this tremendous military machine in 1945, couldn't really be challenged by any of the other powers. But very quickly, as I tried to show in the first few pages of my book, this was all dismantled deliberately because American troops all wanted to come home it was politically impossible to maintain a large army or to even maintain a large Navy and Air Force, let alone an army after the end of World War II. It would have entailed a lot of expense, which Congress was not willing to put out. And so that by 1947 or so, the U.S. did not necessarily have a very formidable army. And as the U.S. found out in 1950 in the Korean War, the American armed forces had their hands full just trying to contain North Korea.
Thanks, Ron. I think that's a great answer. And, I just, agreeing with you, I think if you look at what actually happened during the Cold War and during the years after World War II, despite the preponderance of military power that the United States had, it was never really successful at preventing any revolutionary government or group from taking power, or at least it failed in multiple occasions. It failed during the Korean War, and of course, as you've documented in your other books, it failed miserably in Vietnam. And we see this again and again. We saw it in Afghanistan, where the United States also had preponderance of military power. And we see it again today in Ukraine, where, of course, Russian forces are vastly superior to Ukrainian forces, at least in terms of the quantity of weapons that they have and this, their overall military power. But when it comes to supplanting a government or imposing a specific kind of government, it's actually quite difficult, and the larger military power can't always impose its will exactly as it wishes. So I think that's a very important caveat in terms of how we think about things. So let me move on to the next question. This one comes from Daya Lee. And this question asks, Professor Spector, numerous Western military leaders, including Montgomery, MacArthur, Eisenhower, and Bradley, all warned about the futility of land war in Asia. Their assumption is that the strategy and operational art used by locals in Asia is radically different from the Western military tradition. Do you think that was the case? How much difference do you observe between land war in Asia and European American land warfare?
Well, in the two big conventional types of wars that I talk about in the book, the Korean War and the war in Indochina, I don't see a huge difference. I think the reasons for some of the differences in the way that some of the indigenous forces waged war was their lack of access to the military resources of the colonial powers. But once they get their hands on modern weapons, weapons similar to what the colonial forces have, they use them. And in the Chinese Civil War, both sides are actually, in the end, turns out, are supplied by the Americans, and neither side shows any inclination to try to figure out a whole new kind of warfare. They use those weapons that they've acquired from the Americans, and to a much lesser extent from the Russians.
Okay, thank you again. And we have a question now from Alex McCartney. Alex is assistant professor of the practice at the Elliott School. And Alex, thanks you for a fascinating talk. and says, I'm interested to know more about these Japanese soldiers in Indochina. What were their motivations? Anti-European colonialist ideology, leftover Pan-Asianism of the co-prosperity sphere discourse, or pure materialist motivations?
Professor Daching Yang and I have been very interested over a period of about 10, 15 years with trying to analyze or trying to look at the story of these stay behind Japanese. Professor Yang is mostly interested in civilian businessmen and technicians who stayed on. And I've been more interested in the military ones, but the motivation, as far as I can tell, was a mixture of things. First of all, many of them had formed associations with the local people during the war. And in many cases, that took the form of having local girlfriends or even wives. So that was a big incentive to stay on. Also, some of them still believed in Pan-Asianism. Some of them stayed on for material reasons. The Viet Minh paid them very well during the early stages of the war. Some of them were afraid of being tried as war criminals. That is, there were a number of former Kempite people who stayed on. And then there were people who just didn't see any future for themselves in Japan. They thought they'd never find a job. So there were all these mixtures of reasons. Of course, the most successful of these stay behinds were the ones who stayed in Indonesia. Many of them did well in the late 50s and 60s, organizing businesses to do business in Indonesia. So, and they have a kind of alumni association, I think, that, of course, they're probably getting pretty old, but that was quite active for a while.
Yes, thank you. I think that is a great question that Alex asked, and you know, a very interesting answer. I honestly can't think of any work that deals specifically with this subject. I mean, John Dower talks about this to some degree in Embracing Defeat when he talks about you know, all of the Japanese that were stranded after World War II. But at least to my knowledge, there's no book that deals comprehensively with the subject of all of the different paths that these you know, different Japanese soldiers took once World War II ended, and of course you saw some number of them staying where they were and becoming involved in other conflicts. It's really a fascinating story. So hopefully, if there isn't a book on the subject that I'm missing somewhere, somebody can, you know, someone else will look at that in greater detail one day. So, well, we have now a question from Daniel Spector. I'm not sure what the relationship is, but let me read it off. It says, you mentioned many Japanese soldiers remained in other Asian countries and participated in their civil wars. So again, going back to the remaining Japanese soldiers, how did the locals respond to the presence of these Japanese soldiers? One would assume there was a lot of resentment towards the Japanese after the war.
Yeah, that's correct. That was especially true in Southeast Asia, where the Japanese hadn't conducted themselves very well. And in a couple of these accounts, some of the Japanese who stayed on say that they were kind of put on probation by the locals before they were allowed to become full-fledged members. So yeah, there was a lot of suspicion, and actually Ho Chi Minh wrote a memo, or maybe it was, I can't remember, maybe it was Jap, wrote a memo about these guys, and he said, okay, we have to use these people for the present, but they're not trustworthy, and we want to get rid of them as soon as we can. So there was a lot of suspicion. Now, in the case of China, was a little different. The Chinese communists had a program dating from about 1940, 1941, to try to win over Japanese troops to their side. So they were engaged in trying to recruit people. And then once the war ended, a lot of Japanese found themselves members of the People's Liberation Army or members of the Nationalist Army, whether they wanted to be or not. They were just kept on because a lot of them had technical skills of some kind, and so they weren't allowed to leave. But a lot of them also agreed to stay on because, this is only in China, agreed to stay on because their officers, their whole unit had gone over to the nationalist side. It was mostly the nationalists that initially got most of the organized Japanese units to fight on their side. And Daniel Spector is a close relation. He's my older son.
Okay, thank you. I've probably met him on one occasion, but I'm just sort of blanking on the specific names. So we have another question here. This one comes, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, from Ferdos Intaj. And Ferdos says, thank you for your great informational presentation. The most of the military history was from the 1940s to the 1950s. However, you mentioned you were mostly concerned about the strategies in your book. And I think what Fergus is asking is for you to think a little bit about the connections between what you discuss in your book and the present. Fergus then says the U.S. foreign policy had a huge impact by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in the 1970s. He visited China with President Nixon. And in the 1980s, U.S. foreign policy was more focused on economy under the Reagan administration. If we assume China may use the same strategies to extend their control over South or Southeast Asia, how should the USA adapt to China's diplomatic strategies in the Indo-Pacific region? Would it be more focused on military or the economy? So I think Fergus again is asking you for maybe some insights into current day competition between the United States and China, and how your book sheds, might offer some insight into that.
All right. Well, this is a subject that's been in the news lately because we've been the Defense Department just released, I think it's called the National Strategy for 2022 or whatever it's called. And so the official position of the U.S. is that we're going to compete both militarily and economically with China. But the economic side of American policy in this period was quite different because, to oversimplify a bit, the U.S. had most of the world's wealth in 1940. So it was more a question of how are we, which countries are we going to reward, and in what way, and which rewards will make them or induce them to do what we think they should do.
Thank you. And we have another question has come in from an Elliott School student. I'm going to try to summarize this a little bit. And I think this comes from Tomoyuki Tsugawa, who is in the security studies program in the Elliott School. And Tomoyuki is asking why you didn't say more about anti-colonialist ideology among the Japanese military, I believe, and says that it's Tomoyuki's view that the Empire of Japan fought against the U.S. and U.K. and fought for decolonization. And many Asian leaders post World War II said thank you to the Japanese for their bravery. So, I have my own views of this issue, which I've published elsewhere, but I'm going to let you take that on, Ron.
Well, that depends on which Asian leaders you ask. As I tried to suggest briefly in both of my books on this subject, the experience of occupation by Asians was quite varied. If you ask people in Singapore, for instance, how they remember the Japanese occupation there, you're not going to get many positive views. If you ask people in Indonesia, some of them had more or less positive experiences. Many of them didn't. There was widespread killing by the Japanese army in many of these countries. So, and many other allegations of Japanese atrocities. So it's very much a mixed bag. The most positive aspect of the occupation that most people talk about is it gave lower ranking civil servants, policemen, teachers, and so on. Once the colonials were all locked up, it gave the local teachers, local policemen, local bureaucrats a chance to take on much more responsible jobs, and they found that they could do them just as well as their former white bosses. So that did give a lot of self-confidence and valuable experience to Asians during the occupation.
Right, absolutely. And of course, there's still tons of debate about the impact of Japanese colonialism. And as someone who works on Korea, I certainly hear a lot more of the negative aspect of it, and I don't hear a hell of a lot of people saying expressing gratitude. But admittedly, there are for instance, if you look at Taiwan, the view of Japanese colonialism isn't necessarily sheer gratitude, but it's not as fiercely negative as it is in somewhere like Korea. So I think that's a subject that can be debated, but I think you really have to look at individual countries and maybe individual communities. So we have another question that comes from Seesaw, and the full name isn't there, so I'm just going to read off the question. This question asks, to what extent is the appeal of communism the driving force for national liberation movements in post-World War II Asia? Or is the appeal more of an anti-colonial one, which communism just happens to take advantage of?
It depends, again, it depends on which country you're talking about. In Indochina, of course, the Viet Minh had tremendous appeal, and they were the best organized operation, so to speak. But they always pitched their program as being primarily nationalism rather than communism. In 1945, for a period, Ho Chi Minh formally disbanded the Communist Party. So it depends on where you, which country you're talking about. In Korea, the communists and the anti-communists were duking it out from the very beginning. Both sides claimed that they represented the true spirit of independence and nationalism.
Okay, thank you. And I think I've exhausted most of the audience questions, but I have about we have a little more time. So there's just one other question that I wanted to ask before, and I think this may be half question, half comment. But I think I'm sort of curious in terms of when we talk about accountability. And who's ultimately responsible for all of this violence? I mean, we can talk about governments, we can talk about militaries. It's not really necessarily, I guess, politically correct to say, well, it was the citizens themselves. But to some extent, it strikes me that looking at Korea, that was sometimes the case, because when you had these successful, after North Korean forces occupied South Korea and then were driven out, you had a lot of conservatives living in the village who exacted revenge on people who had sided with the communists, and many people who even had one relative who had sided with the communists were, at times they were tortured in worst case scenarios, but in other cases, they faced discrimination for life. And so, I just wonder, when we talk about accountability, to what extent, I mean, you can talk about militaries, you can talk about, you can talk about governments, but to what extent is this also just a human phenomenon that came out of these horrific social and ideological divisions that existed in Asia at the end of World War II?
Yeah, well, in all of these countries, I think you see lots of examples of people taking advantage of the changing political or military situation to settle scores, and that settling of scores sometimes is organized in a way so that this is a phenomenon in all countries. Korea has some of the worst examples. In Indonesia, you had a case where you have kind of two sets of grievances. You have the Dutch and Eurasian grievances from the time of the Bersiap, and then you have a whole set of Indonesian grievances from the time of the Dutch police actions, where the Dutch murder civilians, destroy property, put people wholesale in jail. So you've got these, I'm sure that right now in the Dutch courts, there's a lot of cases having to do with Dutch atrocities during the War of Independence, but the former Eurasians and their children have a very well organized lobby in the Netherlands also, and they've been pressing for reparations for the last 30 years as well. So It should be a very interesting situation.
Greg, you're muted.
I think I lost the sound.
Greg, you're on mute.
Greg,
Sorry,
you need to
you didn't
unmute.
hear the sound. That was me forgetting to unmute myself. But I was just saying, thank you. And I'm going to end with this question from Daya Lee, who I think we don't really need you to answer it, but it's just a cute question asking, are you going to teach a class about your book next semester? And of course, Professor Spector is a professor emeritus of history. So I don't believe he's still teaching classes, but I think Aldine Ayers would join me in saying that you are welcome back to teach classes with us at any time. And let me just add, one more thing for those of you who are in the audience and are still are either faculty at other schools and are not in graduate school yet, that the MA in Asian Studies at the Elliott School is, Professor Spector contributed a great deal to it over the years. We have a number of other excellent Asian history faculty who teach courses that cover the material that Professor Spector covers in his book. And, we have a number of excellent people who can do that. So if you're still interested in pursuing an MA degree in Asian Studies, or you have a student who's interested in pursuing a policy-oriented degree, either in Asian Studies or security policy studies or another field, please keep the Elliott School in mind. Ayers for joining us, and thanks most of all to Professor Spector for an excellent talk. Unfortunately, we couldn't do this in person, but the book is definitely available. It's available at the GW bookstore, and it's also available on Amazon with the Kindle version now being under $10. So, you can read all of this wonderful stuff for a pretty affordable price. So thank you once again. It's been a pleasure to have you back, Ron.
Thank you. I do. I did teach a course. Unfortunately, I'm immunocompromised. I did teach a course online last fall, and I hope to do so one semester next year. So we'll see.
Well, thank you. We'll be sure to advertise it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.